I don't buy people, Daniel Hayes said quietly, even as the contract screen glowed blue beneath his palm. The black market station vibrated with the low hum of reactor cores somewhere below deck, and the air tasted like hot circuitry and recycled oxygen, as thin as Denver at 10,000 feet. Daniel had come for his money. 50,000 credits for clearing smugglers out of a mining corridor, and instead the Baron across from him smiled with too many teeth and offered collateral in flesh. She stepped forward without being pushed, tall and composed, her skin a deep cerulean blue that caught the flicker of neon overhead, silver hair falling in a clean line over one shoulder, a slim restraint band circling her wrist. She did not lower her eyes. That was the first thing Daniel noticed. Not fear, not desperation. Assessment, as if she were measuring him the way he measured faulty wiring before deciding whether to cut it. Transfer accepted, the Baron purred when Daniel pressed his thumb to the scanner, and the restraint band chimed, sinking to his biosignature with a soft metallic click. Daniel felt the weight of the moment settle in his chest like a dropped wrench. He had seen bad deals before. He had survived betrayal that cost him a ship and almost cost him his life. He would not be part of something that stripped someone else of choice. He waited until the digital seal finalized, until the ownership record flashed green, and then he reached for the band. The release latch responded to his touch. It opened with a whisper. "You're free," he said, not looking at the Baron, only at her. The station seemed to grow quieter, as if even the ventilation fans were holding their breath. She flexed her wrist slowly, studying the exposed skin where the band had been, then lifted her gaze back to him. Up close, her eyes were not just gold but layered, flecks of amber catching the light like polished brass. "Why?" she asked, her voice steady, cultured, unmistakably educated. Not the voice of someone broken. Daniel shrugged, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulder from an old injury that flared in cold air. "Because I don't keep what doesn't belong to me." A faint sound echoed through the station, low and distant at first, like thunder rolling across the plains of Kansas before a summer storm. The overhead lights flickered once. Then again, Daniel's wrist display buzzed with an incoming alert he hadn't authorized. Orbital traffic spiked. 3 unidentified vessels had just dropped out of faster-than-light transit less than 200 miles above the planet's surface. The Baron's smile vanished. Across the open docking bay, every comm unit crackled at once, the same signal overriding local channels. A voice filled the air, clear, commanding, carrying the weight of generations. "This is the royal fleet of Solnara. We are here for High Princess Arya." The woman in front of Daniel did not flinch. She did not look surprised. She only tilted her head slightly, as if confirming a calculation she had already made, and for the first time since she stepped forward, she allowed herself the smallest, almost private smile. The docking bay lights dimmed to emergency amber as the transmission echoed off steel walls and polished cargo crates, and Daniel felt every eye in the station shift from the ceiling to the woman standing 3 feet in front of him. The Baron's hands trembled just enough to rattle the rings on his fingers, while distant engines pulsed through the floor like a second heartbeat, steady and powerful, measured in megatons of authority. Daniel did not look up at the sky because he had learned a long time ago that staring at overwhelming force did not make it any smaller. Instead, he kept his gaze on her, on the faint reflection of warning strobes in her golden eyes, and he spoke evenly. "High Princess, is it?" As if he were asking about the weather. She inhaled slowly, the sound almost lost beneath the station's ventilation system struggling to keep pace with the sudden power fluctuations. And when she answered, her voice carried none of the hesitation he would have expected from someone. "Just declared royal property of an empire. Arya Solnara, first heir to the Solnaran Accord," she said, and then after the smallest pause, "And I did not request extraction." The words settled between them heavier than the fleet outside. Daniel's wrist display continued to vibrate with alerts, orbital lock confirmations, encrypted channels attempting handshake protocols he did not possess clearance to answer, but he muted them with a swipe and leaned one shoulder against a stack of shipping containers as though warships appearing overhead were a mild inconvenience. "Then they are here without your permission," he said. A corner of her mouth lifted, not amused, but acknowledging. "They are here because they believe I was taken," she replied, and her gaze flicked briefly to the Baron, who now looked very small beneath the humming lights. Daniel exhaled through his nose, the scent of heated alloy sharp in his lungs. He had been in tight situations before, though usually with less ceremony. "You were not taken," he said quietly. "You walked forward." She studied him again, that same careful evaluation from earlier. But something had shifted, a fraction softer, less clinical. Across the bay, security personnel whispered into headsets, unsure whether to kneel or run. The transmission returned, firmer now. "Hi, Princess Arya," respond. And this time the tone carried unmistakable urgency. Arya did not reach for a communicator. Instead, she clasped her hands loosely in front of her and asked Daniel, "Why did you break the contract?" As though the fleet could wait, Daniel considered the question longer than the incoming alarms. "Because paper does not decide who someone is," he answered. A faint vibration rolled through the structure as one of the ships adjusted orbit. Thrusters measured in thousands of tons of thrust correcting position with effortless precision. Arya's eyes softened in a way that did not match the steel in her posture. "Then you understand more than most," she said. Daniel pushed off the crate and straightened. "If they think you were taken, they are going to want someone to blame," he observed. She nodded once. "Yes." The Baron opened his mouth, perhaps to protest or negotiate, but the station's main door sealed with a deep mechanical clang, cutting him off. Daniel glanced toward the exit corridor leading to his ship, a modest freighter compared to what hovered above. But "Are you planning to correct them?" he asked. Arya turned her face toward the ceiling, toward the unseen hulls eclipsing the stars, and for the first time uncertainty flickered there, not fear, but calculation. "Not yet," she said softly. "I needed to know something first." Daniel held her gaze as the alarms continued their low metallic pulse through the station walls, a steady reminder that somewhere above them 3 warships were waiting for a single answer. "You needed to know what?" he asked, his voice calm, almost conversational, as if they were discussing a broken fuel line instead of the balance of power in orbit. Arya's eyes shifted back to him, reflective under the amber lights, and she stepped closer by a few inches, close enough that he could see the faint geometric patterns woven into the fabric at her collar, insignia subtle but unmistakably refined. "I needed to know if a human would choose differently when given control," she said. Daniel folded his arms loosely, the old scar along his knuckles catching the light. "Control over what?" "Over someone weaker," she replied. The word weaker carried a trace of irony. A new vibration rippled through the floor as a docking request override attempted to seize the station's systems. But Daniel ignored the flashing notice on the wall console. He had spent years repairing ships that were never meant to last, patching hulls with metal rated for 10,000 pounds of pressure while knowing space would always press harder, and he recognized pressure when he felt it. "You let yourself be sold," he said slowly, piecing it together. She inclined her head once. Yes. Around them, merchants and dockhands were quietly retreating toward exits, the earlier arrogance of the Baron dissolving into silence. Daniel studied her posture, straight spine, shoulders squared not in defiance but in certainty. "You risked a war to run a test." "Not a war," she corrected gently. "A measure." The overhead speakers crackled again, the fleet commander's voice sharper now, requesting confirmation of her status. Arya did not respond. Instead she asked, "When you broke the contract, did you consider the consequences?" Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. "I considered that I would sleep better." The answer lingered between them. She absorbed it the way a scientist might record data. "Most species in this sector equate opportunity with advantage," she said. "If given authority, they exercise it." Daniel shrugged. "Authority does not impress me." A flicker of something warmer crossed her expression, almost relief. The station's main viewport panels shifted from opaque to transparent as external lighting adjusted, and through reinforced glass Daniel could see the silhouettes of the Solnaran vessels, enormous crescents of polished alloy suspended against the black, each one easily half a mile long. Engines glowing with restrained power. They were not firing, not advancing, simply waiting. "They believe you are a victim," he said quietly. "At this moment, yes," Arya replied. "And if you tell them otherwise," she met his eyes fully now, "then the narrative changes." Daniel understood narratives. He had been labeled smuggler, mercenary, traitor, and hero depending on who controlled the channel. Labels shifted faster than orbit. So what happens next? He asked. Arya drew a slow breath, and for the first time since the fleet arrived, the tension in her shoulders eased. Now, she said softly, we see whether they trust my judgment as much as they trust their fear. The station lights steadied, settling into a low amber glow as if even the power grid had decided to wait, and Daniel felt the weight of orbit pressing down through steel and vacuum, not as force, but as expectation. You think they will hesitate, he said quietly. Arya's reflection shimmered in the viewport glass, framed by 3 immense Solnaran ships suspended against the stars, each hull curved like a silver blade stretching nearly 3,000 feet from bow to stern. They will not act. Without certainty, she replied. That is our strength and our weakness. Daniel walked toward the central console, boots echoing softly across the metal deck, and pulled up the external feed on a cracked display panel. Targeting grids flickered in standby mode. Nothing armed, nothing advancing. Only position lights marking disciplined formation. He had seen less restraint from human corporations over disputed mining rights. If they trust your judgment, he said, then you do not need a fleet. A faint breath escaped her, almost a laugh, but not quite. Trust must be demonstrated, she answered. Behind them, the Baron had retreated into shadow, silent now, aware that the room no longer belonged to him. Daniel rested his palms on the edge of the console, feeling the vibration of distant engines measured in terawatts of contained energy. Then demonstrate, he said simply. Arya stepped beside him, close enough that he could sense the subtle difference in her body temperature, cooler than his, like air before rainfall. She raised her hand and extended 2 fingers toward the console without touching it. A soft chime acknowledged her biometric signature even through encrypted channels, and the station's comm array unlocked under royal override. The fleet commander's image resolved in midair, tall, composed, uniform marked with geometric insignia that mirrored the patterns on her collar. High Princess. The commander began, voice controlled but edged with urgency. We have secured orbital superiority and are prepared to extract you. Daniel watched Arya carefully, not the hologram, but her shoulders, her breath. She did not bow, did not step back. Stand down, she said. The words were not loud, yet they carried across the bay and into orbit. The commander's expression shifted, confusion crossing disciplined features. Your Highness, intelligence indicates you were transferred under coercion. Arya's gaze flicked to Daniel for a fraction of a second, then returned to the projection. Intelligence was incomplete, she replied. I was not coerced. The silence that followed was heavier than any weapon. Daniel felt it in his chest, that thin line between assumption and truth. Clarify your status, the commander requested. Arya straightened, chin lifting slightly. I was presented as property, she said evenly, and the human who received that authority dissolved it within seconds. Daniel did not look at her, but something in his posture eased. Outside, one of the massive ships adjusted position by a few hundred yards, engines dimming as if the fleet itself were reconsidering. Are you in danger? The commander asked. Arya paused, and in that pause Daniel understood the measure she had spoken of. She could describe him as threat and justify force, or as choice and alter the course of 2 civilizations. No, she said at last. I am witnessing something rare. The words lingered in the air long after Arya spoke them, and Daniel felt the entire docking bay exhale in slow confusion. Rare was not a term used lightly by empires that measured history in millennia and fleets in millions of metric tons. The holographic commander studied her with disciplined restraint, the projection flickering softly as transmission bandwidth adjusted. Define rare, Your Highness. The commander requested. Arya did not look away from the image, yet her presence beside Daniel felt grounded, deliberate. A species offered unregulated authority, she said calmly, and choosing not to exercise it. Daniel shifted his weight, folding his arms loosely, the metal deck cool beneath his boots. He had not intended to become a philosophical example for an interstellar government. He had simply refused to own another living being. Outside the viewport, the nearest Solnaran cruiser reduced engine output, luminous thrusters dimming from bright white to a muted glow. Its Position stabilizing at approximately 200 miles above the station. Restraint was visible even in orbit. Human, the commander said, and for the first time the projection's gaze shifted directly to Daniel. State your intention. Daniel met the holographic eyes without hostility, without submission. My intention was to get paid, he answered honestly. A faint ripple moved through observers gathered along the edges of the bay. Aria's lips curved slightly, not in mockery, but in recognition. Daniel continued, voice steady. When that did not happen, I made sure no one left here in chains. Silence answered him, heavy and analytical. The commander regarded him for several seconds, measured not by clocks, but by consequence. You understood. Her status was uncertain. The commander observed. I understood she was breathing, Daniel replied. The station's environmental systems hummed steadily, filtering air at a constant 70 degrees Fahrenheit, ordinary details persisting despite extraordinary circumstances. Arya turned her head slightly toward him, studying his profile, as if committing it to memory. You have jeopardized a profitable alliance with the Baron, the commander said. Daniel glanced toward the shadowed figure near the cargo stacks. I can find other work. The response was simple, unembellished. Beyond the glass, a second cruiser adjusted formation, widening the perimeter rather than tightening it. High Princess, the commander said carefully. Your safety remains our priority. Arya drew a measured breath. My safety was never compromised, she answered. What was evaluated was character. Daniel felt the words settle between them like a calibrated weight. Character could not be purchased, could not be transferred by contract. It was revealed in small, irreversible decisions. The commander inclined their head slightly. Your judgment carries significant consequence, they said. I am aware, Arya replied. Her gaze returned to Daniel, no longer assessing but acknowledging. The amber lights reflected softly across her blue skin, and for the first time since the fleet arrived, the tension in the docking bay shifted from threat to contemplation. Outside, 3 warships remained suspended in disciplined silence, not as instruments of force, but as witnesses to a choice that had already been made. The docking bay no longer felt like a marketplace. It felt like a courtroom without walls, with 3 silent judges suspended in orbit and every breath measured against the vacuum outside. Daniel remained beside the console, aware that he stood less than 3 feet from a decision that could reshape trade routes measured in light years. The holographic commander regarded Arya with composed intensity. Your Highness, they said carefully, if this human's actions represent his species, our projections require revision. Arya did not answer immediately. She watched Daniel instead, as if the future of an accord depended not on fleets but on the set of his shoulders. One action does not define a civilization, she replied at last, but it reveals possibility. Daniel felt the weight of that word more than the mass of the cruisers above. Possibility had carried him across sectors in a freighter barely 120 feet long, powered by engines older than some republics. It had kept him working alone, fixing hull fractures in zero gravity while other contractors chased safer profits. The commander shifted the projection slightly, bringing tactical overlays into view, transparent schematics of the station and surrounding orbital grid. There are factions within our council who argue that humans operate primarily through leverage, the commander said. They expected confirmation. Daniel almost smiled. You sent your princess to be sold to confirm a theory, he said quietly. Arya did not flinch at the bluntness. I volunteered, she corrected. If we are to negotiate with Earth on equal terms, we must understand the boundaries of its ethics. Daniel glanced toward the viewport where the nearest cruiser held steady at a calculated distance of 200 miles, engines idling with disciplined restraint. You could have just asked, he said. A faint warmth entered her expression. Would you have answered truthfully under observation? Daniel considered that. Probably not. Observation changed behavior. Pressure revealed it. The commander's voice cut gently through the moment. High Princess, the council requests your immediate return for debriefing. The request was formal, but beneath it lay urgency. Arya's gaze lingered on Daniel a fraction longer before returning to the projection. I will return, she said, but not under extraction protocol. A subtle shift rippled through the fleet's formation outside. Engines recalibrating to standby rather than recovery posture. Clarify, the commander asked, Aria's voice. Remain steady. I will depart as a sovereign representative who entered by choice and leaves by choice. Daniel understood what she was doing. Narratives mattered. If she left as a rescued victim, humans would be catalogued as aggressors. If she left by decision, the record would show restraint. And the human? The commander continued. What is his designation in your report? Aria turned fully toward Daniel now, amber light tracing the contours of her features. He will be recorded as Daniel Hayes, she said, an independent contractor who declined authority when granted absolute discretion. The words were precise, almost ceremonial. Daniel felt a strange stillness settle inside him. He had never cared much for records. Most of his contracts ended in silence and unpaid invoices. Yet this entry would travel farther than any cargo he had hauled. Outside, the 3 warships remained motionless, no longer threatening, simply waiting for their princess to choose the moment she would walk away from power and back into it on her own terms. The holographic projection faded, leaving only the low hum of station generators and the distant presence of ships that could cross light years and hours yet now waited for a single decision made on a steel floor. Daniel let out a slow breath he had not realized he was holding and looked at Aria, not as a princess, not as an evaluation, but as a woman who had stepped into uncertainty on purpose. So you leave, he said quietly. She nodded once, silver hair catching the amber light. Yes, the word carried weight, but not regret. Beyond the viewport, one cruiser shifted orientation by a few degrees, aligning a docking corridor with precise, almost elegant calculation. A transport craft detached from its underbelly, descending in controlled silence toward the station's upper hangar. Daniel checked his wrist display out of habit, watching the telemetry update in real time. Mass, velocity, approach vector, all measured and restrained. You could have told them the truth immediately, he said. You could have ended this in seconds. Aria studied him as though he were still the test. If I had, she replied, I would have learned nothing. He gave a faint nod. That, he understood. Sometimes a system only revealed its flaws when placed under stress. Sometimes it revealed its strength. The Baron had long since disappeared from the edge of the bay, leaving behind only a silent counter and a broken expectation of profit. Daniel turned toward the corridor leading to his ship. A modest freighter docked 3 levels below, hull patched in places with alloy plates that did not quite match. He had repairs to finish and invoices to chase. Life had a way of shrinking back to practical details. Footsteps approached from behind him, soft but deliberate. Aria stopped at his side. Daniel Hayes, she said, speaking his full name as though committing it to something permanent. Your action will be recorded in our archives. He almost laughed. Make sure you spell it right. A faint warmth entered her eyes. It will be preserved accurately. Through the upper bay windows, the descending transport glowed softly. Engines calibrated for gentle contact rather than dramatic arrival. What happens now? He asked. She looked toward the incoming craft. Now I return and report that humanity cannot be summarized by fear. The statement was simple, yet it carried the weight of policy. Daniel felt a subtle tightening in his chest. Not pride. Not exactly. Something steadier. And if your council disagrees, he asked. Aria's gaze returned to him, steady as orbit. Then I will disagree with them. The confidence was not reckless. It was earned. A soft chime echoed through the station, signaling docking clearance granted. Daniel extended his hand without ceremony. For a brief moment she regarded it, then placed her cooler fingers against his. The contact was firm, equal, no ownership, no obligation, just acknowledgement. Outside, 3 warships remained suspended against the stars, not as conquerors, not as rescuers, but as witnesses to a human who had been given absolute power for a heartbeat and chose not to use it. The transport craft touched down with a muted vibration that traveled through the station floor like a distant pulse, controlled and deliberate, its hull gleaming under docking lights calibrated to 70% intensity. Daniel released her hand first, not out of reluctance, but out of understanding, and stepped back half a pace as the upper bay doors sealed behind the arriving vessel. A thin beam of white guidance light extended from the craft to the docking platform, forming a quiet path, rather than a command. Arya looked at it for a moment, then back at him. "They will expect me to return with certainty," she said softly. Daniel folded his arms, feeling the familiar weight of gravity at one standard G anchoring him to the deck. "Then give them certainty," he replied. Her eyes searched his face as though verifying there was no regret hidden beneath his calm. She found none. Around them, the last of the station workers had retreated into observation corridors, watching history. From behind reinforced glass, the air smelled faintly of coolant and warm metal, ordinary scents in an extraordinary hour. The transport's hatch opened without flourish, revealing a minimal interior lit in cool silver tones, a contrast to the station's amber glow. Two uniformed attendants stood within, hands at their sides, posture respectful rather than urgent. Arya did not move immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to Daniel once more. "You understand what this means," she said. It was not a question about politics. It was about consequence. Daniel considered the miles of vacuum between the station and the waiting fleet, the thousands of crew members who would read her report, the council chambers where his name would be spoken by beings who had never seen Earth. "It means you tell them the truth," he answered, "and they decide what to do with it." She held his gaze a second longer. "No," she said quietly. "It means I decide how they will see it." Outside the viewport, one cruiser's running lights shifted from standby amber to diplomatic blue, a subtle change but unmistakable in intention. Daniel noticed. He noticed details for a living. "You are changing more than a report," he said. Arya inclined her head slightly. "So are you." The attendants waited without interruption. Time, for once, felt patient. Arya turned toward the beam of guidance light, silver hair catching the edge of it, and began to walk. Each step was measured, not hurried, not hesitant. Halfway to the hatch she paused and looked back over her shoulder. The station behind her looked small compared to the fleet above, and Daniel looked smaller still, a single human in a worn jacket standing under industrial lights. Yet there was no imbalance in the way she regarded him, only acknowledgement. "Daniel Hayes," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the bay without amplification. "When the council convenes, I will request formal dialogue with your world." He gave a slight nod. "Then I hope they are ready to listen." A faint, almost private smile touched her lips before she crossed the threshold into the transport. The hatch sealed with a soft tone, and seconds later the craft lifted smoothly, rising toward ships that had come prepared for rescue and were leaving with something far less predictable. Daniel remained in the docking bay long after the transport became a silver speck against the dark, his boots planted on steel that still carried the faint vibration of departing engines. Through the reinforced viewport, he watched the craft rise the final few miles toward the nearest cruiser, its trajectory smooth and unhurried, as if even the vacuum understood this was not an extraction but a return. When the transport locked into the cruiser's hull, a soft pulse of light traveled along the massive ship's spine, running nearly half a mile from bow to stern before fading into diplomatic blue. One by one, the other vessels adjusted formation, widening their orbit rather than tightening it, shifting from a posture of intervention to one of presence. Daniel let out a quiet breath and flexed his fingers, the imprint of her cooler handshake lingering in memory more than sensation. Around him, the station slowly resumed its ordinary rhythm. Ventilation fans cycling at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, cargo lifts humming, distant voices cautious but no longer hushed. The crisis had not erupted into chaos. It had resolved into something quieter. On his wrist display, external telemetry updated as the Solnaran fleet initiated departure sequence. Gravity anchors disengaging, faster than light, drives warming in controlled increments measured in terajoules. He watched the numbers out of habit, appreciating the precision even if he would never command such power. A brief transmission flickered across open channels, not a demand, not an order, but a formal declaration of diplomatic intent, referencing Earth by its proper designation and requesting structured dialogue within the next standard cycle. Daniel smiled faintly, somewhere beyond sight. In a chamber lined with polished alloy and ancient symbols, Arya would be standing before her council. recounting a transaction that lasted less than 5 minutes yet outweighed the mass of their warships. She would describe a human who had been granted complete authority over another life and chose to dissolve it without negotiation. He did not imagine she would embellish. She did not seem the type. Outside the viewport, space shimmered briefly as the first cruiser entered faster than light transit, its immense form folding into a distortion that vanished without sound. The second followed. Then the third, leaving the sky clear and ordinary again, stars scattered like cold dust. The docking bay felt larger without them, but not emptier. Daniel turned toward the corridor leading to his freighter 3 levels below, hull patched and imperfect, engines that required careful tuning every few thousand miles. He had invoices to resend and a coolant leak to seal. The universe had not changed its size, only its perception. As he walked, the overhead lights reflected softly off metal floors, and for a moment he paused to glance back at the viewport. There was nothing there now but darkness and distant light. He had not freed an empire, had not negotiated a treaty, had not raised a weapon. He had simply declined to own someone when given the chance. In a galaxy measured by power, that refusal echoed farther than any fleet, quiet and unrecorded except in the memory of a princess who had gone looking for weakness and found something else entirely.